Congregational Prayer. The words will be shown on the screen. Let us now pray together. We offer our salutations to the all-loving being who endows all beings with consciousness. We meditate on the Lord, who is the origin of the universe. Lord, thou abidest in all. Thou art all. Thou assumest all forms. Thou art the origin and goal of all. Thou art the self of all. Thou art existence, knowledge, and bliss. Salutations unto thee. May the world be peaceful. May the wicked become gentle. May all creatures think of mutual welfare. May our minds be occupied with what is spiritual and abiding. May our hearts be immersed in selfless love for the Lord. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. So our topic for tonight is Transcendentalism. It was a philosophical movement which arose in New England, Concord, Massachusetts area in the 1800s. So we will transport you back tonight to that area around Walden Pond. You can imagine yourself on a snowy winter night somewhere in the Concord, Massachusetts area. But of course, my perspective is not just on the Transcendentalism, but it is on Transcendentalism as filtered through my viewpoint after having studied yoga and Vedanta. So it's really Transcendentalism, but a yoga Vedantic perspective, and it's really some contemplations that I found while reading Emerson's work this summer, which I found helpful for actually strengthening awareness of the divine and also giving me a different insight or a different way of looking at some of the Vedantic teachings. And we'll see why that came up. Emerson himself had access to the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, so that influence is there, and we'll see a quote from him later on, what he says about that. But I'm going to start off with Vedanta, this being the Vedanta Society, teaches us that we have the three fundamental desires around which all of our activities revolve. And these three are called Satchidananda in Sanskrit, which are infinite existence, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss. We all want to be. We never want not to be. Not to be is to death, is to not exist. We like to know everything. No one likes to be in the dark about any subject. We all want to know as much about everything as possible. And of course, we all want unlimited happiness. You know, Swami says over and over again, during his talks, do you ever want to limit the amount of happiness, right? Nobody ever raises their hand. We all want the unlimited happiness. And if any of these are limited, right, it means eventual death or partial ignorance and alternating periods of pleasure and pain. And saints and sages of all traditions say that these three, infinite existence, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss, are the nature of God. I don't know any that says that God is limited. But Vedanta says that these three, yes, are indeed the nature of God, or the highest reality, but that they're also our own nature. And they exclaim, thou art that, or aham Brahma asmi, I am the Brahman. So from the universal and perennial search for an actual experience of this fundamental truth, the various scriptures, myths, philosophies, and religions have evolved over time. And at the personal level, too, life can simply be said to be an individual search for realizing and manifesting our desire for the experience of infinite existence, infinite knowledge, and infinite happiness in our lives. And the difference between secular and sacred, if there is a difference at all, may be about how we go about that search. All religions have four parts: ritual, myth, philosophy, and direct experience. Differences arise in rituals, in the myths, in the philosophies, but direct experience is the common element and will be the same for all. And Vedanta holds that all searches eventually lead to this experience, and thus one of the four cardinal principles of Vedanta is true acceptance of all religions And the emphasis here is being on true acceptance as opposed to a lesser ideal of simple tolerance. So tonight we're going to explore the philosophical movement called Transcendentalism, which arose in New England in the 1800s. Two of the more well-known figures of that movement are Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I spent a lot of time reading Emerson this summer, actually, and I found many of my thoughts and contemplations were echoed in his writings, too. But I found them helpful in exploring connections to the divine and furthering the teachings of Vedanta and yoga in my life, and I want to try to share that with you tonight. So to give you a sense of transcendental thought in the writings, let us begin by looking at one of the verses from Emerson's essay, The Older Soul. So he says there, "Our faith comes in moments. Our vice is habitual. Yet there is a depth in those brief moments which constrains us to ascribe more reality to them than all other experiences." That's end quote. And so right there's much to analyze and contemplate, and that's just this one small verse from his essay. First is the habitual nature of thought, which pulls us continually away from our true nature, which is the state of unlimited happiness and peace. Vivekananda, of course, described the nature of the mind as an intoxicated monkey, stung by a scorpion, possessed by a demon, and just jumpy by its own nature, so you can imagine how difficult it is to control. And we see sort of this similar idea in Emerson when he states our vice is habitual, habitual meaning its regular or default mode. But the verse also gives us hope, because it's showing that all is not lost to habitual vices, because the divine occasionally peeks through to give us a glimpse into higher experiences. And we know intuitively that these are experiences of a higher reality. They need no proof to justify them. And as Emerson has said, we are constrained to ascribe more reality to them than all other experiences. And the emphasis here is constrained. And this constraint, I feel, is inborn and intuitive. It's the reason when people hear truth, they gravitate to it subtly. And it's the reason I think we continue in our persistence of these studies of Vedanta, yoga, and other religious things, because we know when we hear something that sounds true, it cuts through, even at a very subtle internal level. Doesn't need to be taught. And so it's these moments, these glimpses into the higher reality which encourages us, because it shows that spiritual effort has tangible fruit if we are willing and able to take the time and make the effort. In chapter 1, verse 30 of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, falling away from these momentary glimpses is listed as one of the obstacles to yoga and to the fullest and highest realization. So I'll quote from Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga, which is a commentary on the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, chapter 1, verse 30. It says, "Disease, mental laziness, doubt, lack of enthusiasm, lethargy, clinging to sense enjoyments, false perception, non-attaining concentration, and falling away from the state when obtained are the obstructing distractions." And so Emerson describes this, and I'm going to do a quote with some minor edits, so it's more of an adaptation, but it's almost a direct quote, on this momentary essence of his experience. Oops. I guess I don't need a slide for that. Okay, so quoting from Emerson. "It is not to be denied that there must be some wide difference between my faith and other faith, and mine is a certain brief experience, which surprised me in some place at some time, whether in the body or out of the body, God knoweth, and made me aware that I had played the fool with fools all this time. But that law existed for me and for all, that to me belonged trust, a child's trust and obedience, and the worship of ideas, and I should never be fool more. Well, in the space of an hour probably, I was let down from this height. I was at my old tricks, the selfish member of a selfish society. My life is superficial, takes no root in the deep world. I ask, when shall I die and be relieved of the responsibility of seeing a universe which I do not use? I wish to exchange this flash of lightning faith for continuous daylight, this fever glow for a benign climate. That's the end of the Emerson. And so thus initially the goal of spiritual life is to remember the momentary high flights and experiences and inspirations that we have, and to bring this more and more into the day-to-day experiences, ultimately making permanent these brief moments of high flight until they become constant in the continual background on which our lives play out. One of my favorite examples of such high flight and vision of the universal oneness comes actually from the Italian Renaissance poet Dante Alighieri's work, The Divine Comedy. At the climax of his third book of this trilogy, Dante has the vision of the oneness and finally comprehends how all the disparate events in the universe are connected. And so both Emerson and Patanjali have said it is difficult to hold this vision for long, and Dante too soon to begin to fall from this height. And I'm going to quote directly from the Longfellow translation of this. It's a really beautiful passage. Dante, after having the vision and comprehending universal oneness. O light supreme that dost so far uplift thee from the conceits of mortals, to my mind of what thou didst appear, relent a little, and make my tongue of so great a power, that but a single sparkle of thy glory it may bequeath unto future people. For by returning to my memory somewhat, and by a little sounding in these verses, more of thy victory shall be conceived. I think the keenness of the living ray which I had endured would have bewildered me, if but mine eyes had been averted from it. And we see this too in the Hindu texts where that illumination is described as the light of 1,000 suns. So we can barely look into a single sun. Imagine what it's like trying to look into 1,000 suns. And he says this. I think it would have bewildered me. But then he goes on. And I remember that I was more bold on this account to bear, so that I joined my aspect with the glory infinite. O grace abundant, by which I presume to fix my sight on the light eternal, so that the seeing I consumed therein. I saw then its depths far down below as lying, bound up with love together in one volume, what through the universe is leaves scattered. That's an end quote. And I think that's for me, is a very delightful and poetic description of a transcendental experience. See, he was consumed into the glory infinite, into the living ray, and he saw at that time the universe, what appears to be disparate and conflicting events, antagonistic elements that we think at the mortal level somehow gets resolved into a unity during the transcendental experience. And he says it's all bound together like love, so you can imagine the pages of the book all bound together with a common binder. And we have similar ideas in Vedanta, too. We have the example of the movie and the screen, the light from the movie projector, which is the living ray of Dante, dances across the screen and creates scenes of tragedy and comedy, but the witness, the screen, or the Shakshi, remains ever unaffected. Another Vedantic example I like is the street light, which illumines the play of children at dusk, a wedding procession in the evening, a murder at midnight, and the quiet stillness of the pre-dawn hour. And so we'll look at some more verses now from Emerson, and I'm going to sample primarily from 5 essays: The Transcendentalists, The Oversoul, Nature, Self-Reliance, and Spiritual Laws. And believe me, we can only do a short sample. There's so much there. But before we get into the verses, I want to do a thought experiment. So what I want you to do, I'm going to show a picture, or actually a series of 3 pictures. They'll all come up together. Take about 15 seconds, Look at each one and decide which is the biggest creature that you see. And then you can just keep the answer to yourself for now, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later, okay? So, which is the biggest creature? Okay, so let's take up some verses from Emerson, and you'll see why I did that experiment and how it fits in near the end of the talk. So in his essay, Nature, he described one of his experiences as follows. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. So I do want to point out here that his use of the word mean in all of his essays conveys the notion of sparseness and paucity, not necessarily the way we use it today as being hurtful or malicious, so it just means sparse. So when you see that in Emerson, that's typically what he means. But back to his description. And again, we see a lot of descriptions of an ego-less sentient being observing all things contained within the consciousness. We see it in yoga and other places too. We just saw it from Dante Alighieri. In the Rig Veda, Purusha Shuktam, it says the Purusha has 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, and is spread all over the universe. This Purusha contains all that has happened and all that is yet to happen. Similar idea. In Paramahansa Yogananda's poem Samadhi, he also has a similar description to Emerson. And the NASA astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who explored the moon as part of Apollo 14, also described an experience he had while coming back from the moon. And this experience to him was so profound that it changed the focus of his life from space exploration to the exploration of consciousness. He founded the Noetic Sciences, and he didn't really understand. And so he did extensive research trying to find out what was this that I experienced. You can imagine coming back from the moon, just 3 people in a small enclosed space. They go through lots of rotational motions and things. And you don't really see much until you get back to the Earth's field of view. But he said, after researching it, the best explanation of what he experiences was found in the text of yoga. So what then does yoga teach? So paraphrasing again, adapting from Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga, it teaches that people are right in claiming that all this knowledge came to them from beyond reasoning, but that it came from within themselves. The yogi teaches that the mind itself has a higher state of existence beyond reason, a superconscious state. And when the mind gets to that higher state, metaphysical and transcendental knowledge come, transcending ordinary nature, ordinary human nature. And continuing from Raja Yoga. This sometimes comes by chance to a person who does not understand its science. When stumbled upon, it is generally interpreted as coming from outside. This explains why transcendental knowledge may be the same in different countries, but the explanations and descriptions will be different. Continuing still from Raja Yoga. What does it mean? It means that the mind brought the knowledge by its own nature, and that the finding of the knowledge was interpreted according to the belief and education of the person through who it came. So that's the end of the Raja Yoga. Now I'm going to go to Complete Works, Volume 5, still speaking from Swami Vivekananda's writings. Men and women want facts in their own consciousness. Only through such experience can there be any reality in religion. Spiritual facts are to be gathered mostly from the superconscious state of mind. Let us put ourselves into the same condition. Then, if we have similar experience, they become facts for us. We can see all that another has seen. A thing that happened once must, under the same circumstances, happen again. Raja Yoga teaches us how to reach the superconscious state. All the great religions recognize this state in some form, but in India, special attention is paid to this side of religion. And that's the end of Swami Vivekananda's quote from the Complete Works. And so, as I was reading Emerson this summer, I found my own thoughts reflected in there so frequently I began to wonder, geez, was I a contemporary or a former student of Emerson in a previous life? And this idea that we see our own thoughts reflected in the works of others itself is in the writings of Emerson, which continues the amusement for me. And so this is what he says. He says, "Speak your latent conviction, and it shall be the universal sense. For in the inmost, in time, becomes the outmost, and our first thought is rendered back to us by the trumpets of the last judgment. Familiar as the voice of the mind is to each of us, the highest merit we ascribe to Moses or Plato or Milton. And that is that they sat not at writing books or establishing traditions, and instead simply spoke what they thought. So we should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across our minds from within, more than the luster of firmament of bards and sages. Yet we dismiss without notice our own thought. In every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. Great works of art have no more affecting lesson for us than this. They teach us to abide by our spontaneous impression. Else tomorrow a stranger will say with masterly good sense precisely what we have thought and felt all the time, and we shall be forced to take with shame our opinion from another." And that's from his essay on self-reliance. Now this idea that the inmost in due time becomes the outmost, and our first thought is rendered back to us, is also seen in many traditions. There is a Sanskrit verse there, what is here is there, and what is not here is nowhere. And in general, the contents of mind and the manifestations of matter which are seen in the universe are also reflected or present in the human body in some way, is a general principle. We see it in yoga, the alchemy, the traditions of the Rosicrucians, and many other mystical traditions. So those ideas are there. And so now let's see where this word transcendentalism came from. We saw it already in both Emerson and Swami Vivekananda's quotes. So we're going to take a look at the meaning from Emerson. The first thing we have to say respecting what are called new views here in New England at the present time is that they are not new, but they are the very oldest of thoughts, cast into the mold of these new times. The light is always identical in its composition, but falls on great variety of objects. And so by falling is first revealed to us not in its own form, for it is formless, but in theirs. In like manner, thought only appears in the objects it classifies. Okay, I'm going to continue reading Emerson, but I want to just point out in the rest of this section, he uses two words. He uses the word transcendentalist and also idealists, and they're equivalent. So he says here, what is popularly called transcendentalism among us is idealism. Idealism as it appears in 1842. So to remain true to the original, I've left the word idealist in the remaining of the quote, but just understand that idealist and transcendentalist could have been exchanged with no loss of the meaning. So you'll hear the word idealist from here forward. As thinkers, humankind have ever divided into two sects, materialists and idealists. The first class founding on experience, the second, idealists, on consciousness. The first class, materialists, beginning to think from the data of the senses. The second class perceive that the senses are not final and say the senses give us representations of things, but what the things themselves are, they cannot tell us. The materialists insist on facts, on history, on the force of circumstances, and the animal wants of of humankind. The idealist on the power of thought and the power of will, on inspiration, on miracle, on individual culture. These two modes of thinking are both natural, but the idealist contends that the transcendental way of thinking is higher in nature. The idealist concedes all that the materialist affirms. The idealist admits the impressions of the senses, admits their coherency, their use and beauty, but then asks the materialists for assurance that the things are as the senses represent them. But the idealists affirm facts not affected by the illusions of sense, facts which are of the same nature as the faculty which reports them and not liable to doubt, facts which in their first appearance to us assume a native superiority to material facts, degrading these into a language by which the first are to be spoken, facts which only need a retirement from the senses to discern. And so he calls in many of his writings for the need of solitude and meditation. He got a lot of his insights from studying nature and watching animals and the interactions of things. So in Raja Yoga, Swami Vivekananda, what we just heard from Emerson in the following way. So we see this in Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga. If a mosquito stings us, our hand will strike it automatically, instinctively. This is one expression of thought. All reflex actions of the body belong to this plane of thought. There is, again, the other plane of thought, consciousness. We reason, we judge, we think, we see the pros and cons of certain things, yet that is not all. We know that reason is limited. Reason can go only to a certain extent. Beyond that, it cannot reach. The circle within which reason runs is very, very limited indeed. Yet at the same time, we find facts rush into this circle. Like the coming of comets, certain things come into this circle. It is certain they come from outside the limit of reason, although reason cannot go beyond. And so I like Vivekananda's explanation of the comet as coming into the circle of reason. And so we can think our year, our time scale of the year, we go through the seasons. It's pretty regular, it's circular, we kind of predict that. We can look at the motion of the other planets. But things like comets come by once, or maybe once it's such a large period that in a lifetime we only get to see it once. So Halley's Comet, I don't remember how many of you went to see Halley's Comet when it came in 1986. It came in the spring, roughly I think late March, early April. And I remember it was like midnight one night. It was like early in the morning too. It was like very low on the horizon, even at like 4 a.m. And so I was loading up my car to go to Duxbury Beach in that cold April morning. And some friends were coming by, probably just coming home from their night of revelry or whatever they were doing. And they said, "Where are you going at this time of the morning?" And I just told them this whole story about, well, if you come, you'll get to have something in common with Isaac Newton, and you'll see. And I must have made it sound like a great thing. I convinced them all, even though they were out all night, to come along. So we got in the car, we drove down to Duxbury Beach, about 45 minutes from where I was living at the time. And there were a good couple hundred people on the beach, so I wasn't the only crazy one. And some had telescopes and binoculars and everything, and we're looking up. And I knew the constellation that it was supposed to be in, so I could at least orient myself. And I looked, and I saw it, and I said, that's it. And all my friends, what? I said, "You see that fuzzy thing way over there, just a little smaller?" "Yeah, we can hardly see that. What is that?" I said, "That's the thing we came to see." And they all shook their head. "You dragged us all the way down here for that." And I said, "But you don't understand the significance. It only comes around every 76 years. And us being in our 20s at the time or so, this is your only chance to see that. I could be home in a warm bed right now. But you dragged me down here." But anyhow, I went back the next morning too. alone. But it was significant for me, maybe not for everybody, but I doubt I'll get to see it again. But that's why I like, this is a big aside, but that's why I like Swami Vivekananda's thought that these glimpses of the divine come to us like comets. Even if they are regular, the intervals are so sparse sometimes, or that we don't get much in the beginning. But it's a very nice description of how these transcendental thoughts come to us from outside the circle of reason. That is, we can ponder and reason all day long. It's only when we shut off that part of the brain that inspiration will come to us. So, that's my aside on going to see Halley's Comet. So just continuing on here now with Emerson, we're going to see where the name transcendental comes from. He says, these ideas come from beyond the limits of reason and do not come from the sense data, were called transcendental forms by Immanuel Kant. And this is where the name Transcendentalism got its name. The name of Transcendentalism comes from the use of that term by Immanuel Kant of Königsberg, who replied to the skeptical philosophy of Locke. Locke insisted that there was nothing in the intellect which was not previously in the experience of the senses. But Kant showed that there was a very important class of ideas, or imperative forms, which did not come by experience, but through which experience is acquired. And these were intuitions of the mind itself, and he denominated them transcendental forms, and thus they picked up the name Transcendentalism. So now I want to come back to the thought experiment that we did. You can think of your answer, recall your answer, and we're going to see different ways to look at your answer. So Emerson goes on to say that those with a materialistic orientation give priority to the testimony of the senses, but the transcendentalist gives a different metric. In the order of thought, the materialist takes departure from the external world and esteems humans as one product of that external world. The idealist takes departure from consciousness and reckons the world an appearance. The materialist respects sensible masses, society, government, social art, luxury, every establishment, every mass, whether majority of numbers or extent of space, or amount of objects, or every social action. The idealist has another measure, which is metaphysical, namely the rank which things themselves take in consciousness, not at all the size or appearance. Mind is the only reality of which people and all other natures are better or worse reflectors. Nature, literature, history are only subjective phenomenon. And so I found this idea of rank order very useful for our spiritual practice. So I came up with this thought experiment. This was not in Emerson. But think back to whatever you, and there's no right or wrong here. Whatever you picked is fine, but we're just going to look at the answer you picked from these different perspectives. So a materialist who relies on sense data may have picked the elephant as the biggest, based on your experience that you may have had at a zoo, or maybe you have seen one in the wild. But of course, for those of us who have seen elephants, yeah, they're massive, and so you might want to pick them as the largest. Or perhaps some of you looked at the pictures and said, well, the tiger is the biggest in terms of the number of pixels that it has on the page. So I intentionally zoomed in on the tiger to make it bigger than the elephants and to make it bigger than the little kitten. So you may have picked that if you use that kind of rationale, and that would be fine in another sense too. Or the kitten actually could be the biggest in terms of metaphysical rank order. And the analysis goes something like this. First of all, the word biggest has two meanings, right? Physical size or importance. We say, like in the usage, the biggest decision of my life could be equally stated as the most important decision of my life. So someone with a cat at home, or even just simply fond of cats, though it's physically the smallest in terms of our day-to-day sense experience, and second in the relative size of the images, The kitten still could be considered the biggest in the terms of rank order from the viewpoint of personal involvement, emotional concern. I love my cat. I talk to my cat. I need to feed the cat. I need to let the cat out if it's an outside going cat. I need to get cat food when I go shopping. So in terms of rank order, the cat could be forever in our mind. We might seldom think of elephants or tigers, unless, of course, we live maybe in a place where elephants and tigers are around, in which case the tiger, if you're going outside, may take a higher rank order for your reasons of safety of you or your friends or your family. But, so hopefully it's the idea of rank order, which Emerson brought to my mind, is really important because it says that it's subjective and situational dependent. And I mean, you could still pick the elephant as the biggest if you were a caretaker of an elephant and the elephant was in your day-to-day, or the tiger, or whatever. So there's no right or wrong per se. It's just a way of looking at physical sense data versus the rank order an idea holds in your mind. And so from a religious perspective, a bhakti or a devotee must continually observe your internal dialogue, because what should have your the highest rank in your mind? God, your chosen ideal. We should continually be coming back to that over and over again. And we see this in the biblical commandment too. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Means just this. God should have the highest rank in our thoughts. A Vedantist must always ask and continually observe, who is experiencing this phenomenon? What is the ground of my being? Who am I? Right? And following the ideas of the Mundukya Upanishad, we should always be asking this. Who is the witness of the waking state? Who is the witness of the dream state? Who is the witness of the dreamless sleep state? And then that's a point that a lot of the swamis make, right? So how do you know you slept well if you weren't there to observe that you had a peaceful sleep, right? So the witness is present even in the dreamless sleep state. And we saw that. I gave that example earlier of the street light, which illumines the children at play at dusk, a wedding in the evening, a murder at midnight, in the still fog of the pre-dawn. And you can kind of think of this Vedantic example as that, the waking state, the playing of the children, the wedding, the murder, the comedy and tragedies of life. And then the still fog of the pre-dawn is that deep sleep state, perhaps. Okay. So I find it helpful because since coming across this idea, I find it triggers me. And thoughts as they arise in my mind, I remember this notion of rank order. And I use it to recognize that some thought was there and it should be processed as required by the needful, and then immediately try to bring our mind or my mind back to the desired state. And so you might be saying, well, this isn't really anything new. Swami always teaches think of God, only of God. And that is true. That is true. I'm not necessarily, and neither did Emerson say it's new. But the idea of rank order, at least to me, recognizes that other ideas do come up in our mind as part of our day-to-day processing, and that they should be returned, and I put an emphasis on the word turn here because you can turn your thoughts, to the thought we want, not the many that are intruding distractions, right? We saw early on that Emerson said our vice is habitual. Things keep happening, right? Arjuna says the same thing, Krishna and Arjuna, right? How is it that I want to do something, but I can't do it? It's, right, that whole dialogue in chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita. It's just continually fighting and trying to discipline. So in the remaining time, what I would like to do now is I want to sort of build this, what I call it a tapestry, because I took writings from Emerson, I took writings from Vivekananda, and I'm going to weave them together. And so I'm going to take a little bit from Emerson, a little bit from Vivekananda, a little bit from Emerson. And to me, it fits together like a seamless tapestry. And then I'll give the final weave to Swami Trigun Natitananda, one of the original direct disciples. But just make sure you understand. So, and I will tell you when I'm switching back and forth. But at least to me, this goes together so seamlessly. If I didn't tell you when I was switching back and forth, you might not even know if I was reading from Emerson or Vivekananda. Okay, so with that, we did the thought experiment. And so I'll begin with Emerson. The Transcendentalist does not respect labor or its resulting property, otherwise than as a manifold symbol, illustrating with wonderful fidelity of details the laws of being. Does not respect government except for as far as it reiterates the laws of mind. Nor the church, nor charities, nor arts for themselves, but hears as a vast distance what they say, as if his consciousness would speak through a pantomimic scene. And so this idea of pantomimic scene really struck me in two ways. First, we're going to see that it shows up in Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga in very similar words. Just the vision that it creates, that this whole life goes on and we remain a witness as if we were watching somebody pantomime all the tragedies and comedies of life in front of us. And this is a bit of an aside from my tapestry, but it's worth pointing out because it was another thing that Emerson said, which I found a very interesting idea. He says, we think that the laws and rules of society are impressed upon us by an external authority. But he made the observation or the point that societal laws are descriptions of and come into being from human behaviors and tendencies. And so if you think about that, you ponder that a little bit, right? It says, and this is this idea of witness. So why do certain laws about stealing or speeding, right? So you drive down the road here, on every corner there's one of those red light monitors or speed monitors. Well, if there was no reason to put them up, they wouldn't put them up, right? So, it's a reflection of human behavior as well. So I thought that was an interesting point Emerson made, that laws and rules come up as a reflector of human behavior. But anyhow, back to my tapestry. So we just heard about the pantomimic scene of which we are a witness. And so now I'll continue with Swami Vivekananda in the Raja Yoga. You are the only sentient being. Mine is only the instrument through which you catch the external world. Take this book. As a book, it does not exist outside. What exists outside is unknown and unknowable. The unknowable furnishes the suggestion that gives the blow to the mind, and the mind gives out the reaction in the form of a book. In the same manner as when a stone is thrown into water, the water is thrown against it in the form of waves. The real universe is the occasion of reaction of the mind. A book form or an elephant form or a human form is not outside. All that we know is our mental reaction from the outer suggestion. Matter is the permanent possibilities of sensation, said John Stuart Mill. It is only the suggestion that is outside. Take an oyster, for example. You know how oysters are made. A parasite gets inside the shell and causes irritation. And the oyster throws out a sort of enameling around it, and this makes the pearl. The universe of experience is our own enamel, so to say, and the real universe is the parasite serving as the nucleus. Thus you now understand what is meant by mind stuff and vrittis are the waves and ripples rising in it when external causes impinge upon it. These vrittis are our universe, and that's the end of Swami Vivekananda. So I'll now switch back to Emerson. From this transfer of the world into consciousness, this beholding of all things in the mind follows easily the whole ethics of the Transcendentalists. It is simpler to be self-dependent. The height, the deity of humankind is to be self-sustained, to need no gift, no foreign force. Society is good when it does not violate me, but best when it is likened to solitude. And again, we see these ideas. You see the monks that go live in the mountains like Arunachala, or some of the aparigraha, one of the yamas and niyamas of yoga and things are also there. So let's continue with Emerson. Everything real is self-existent. Everything divine shares the self-existence of deity. All that you call the world is a shadow of that substance which you are, the perpetual creation of the powers of thought, of those that are dependent and of those that are independent of your will. Do not encumber yourself with fruitless pains to mend and remedy remote effects. Let the soul be erect and all things will go well. You think me the child of my circumstances. I make my circumstance. Let any thought or motive of mine be different from what they are. The difference will transform my condition and economy. I, this thought which is called I, is the mold into which the world is poured like melted wax. The mold is invisible, but the world betrays the shape of the mold. You call it the power of circumstance, but it is the power of me. Am I in harmony with myself? My position will seem to you just and commanding. Am I vicious and insane? My fortunes will seem to you obscure and descending. As I am, so shall I associate, and so shall I act. Caesar's history will paint out Caesar. Jesus acted so because he thought so. I do not wish to overlook or gainsay any reality. I say I make my circumstance, but if you ask me whence am I feel like others, my relation to that fact, capital fact, which cannot be spoken or defined, nor even thought, but which exists and will exist. And that's the end of Emerson. And that called to my mind a quote from Nisargadatta Maharaj, one of the Vedantists, when he was asked, with all of the war and poverty and pain going on around you, do you not see a world full of suffering and problems? And his answer was, in my world, nothing ever goes wrong. A very interesting perspective. And we saw that earlier in the Divine Comedy from Dante Alighieri as well. Remember, he was consumed into that infinite, into the living ray. And at that time, he saw what through the universe seems like scattered, unrelated, disconnected individual leaves are really bound together. And the binding was love. And so now, we will give, I think, the final comments of the tapestry to Swami Triguna Titananda, one of the original disciples, and this final quote will come from the collection of works called Religion and Its Practice. It was formerly known as The Message of the Master, I believe. And so he asks the question, and then he gives some advice. He says, we have been born again and again, but what have we done to raise ourselves, to become divine? We have run again and again after sense enjoyments and suffered untold miseries, but never too late to mend. A moment's sincere resignation of oneself and everything possesses at the feet of the Lord is quite sufficient to ensure one's liberty. Yes, it must be sincere. This single act will revolutionize one's outlook on life. The world as it is full of misery, but it lies within the power of each man and each woman to transform it into all bliss. Every man is God, every woman is none else but Divine Mother. Change your present outlook on life, and the kingdom of heaven is here and now. And that's the end of Swami Trigunatitananda's things. We saw a similar thing in Emerson. In his journals, he has a note there, to different minds, the same word is a heaven, and the same word is a hell. And a couple other nice quotes that I liked was, the roses under my window make no reference to former roses or to better ones. They are what they are. They exist with God today. There is no time to them. There is simply the rose. It is perfect in every moment of its existence. And that comes from his essay, Self-Reliance. All right. And lastly, just the references and public domain statements. Because we upload to YouTube, we just want to make sure that we follow all of the proper rules for intellectual property. And so that completes the talk. So we have a few minutes left, and then we can begin arati. I can do the announcements and the closing prayer as well. Swami Yogatmananda is currently in Atlanta. He gave a retreat yesterday, and will be giving lectures. He's expected to be back on time on Tuesday. The Tuesday and Friday classes will go on as usual. This coming Saturday, December 7th, there's a full-day spiritual retreat which will be given by Swami Yogatmananda on the songs of divine love from various traditions. That's a full-day event. Naomi, is registration still open for that? Okay, so there's still room if you'd like to register for that program. There's Hatha Yoga on Tuesdays starting at 5:30. Next Sunday, the talk will be given by a visiting Swami Satya Mayananda from the Vedanta Society of Hollywood, California. The title is The Many Aspects of You, and that will be followed immediately by a music concert by Indian Hammer Dulcimer by Vinay Desai on santoor, accompanied by Yogesh Karaleo on tabla. Coming up on Sunday, December 15th, is the full-day celebration of Sarada Devi's birthday. That begins at 11 a.m. with worship, flower offering, prasad lunch, videos, the symposium, singing, and supper prasad per our standard format for those programs. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's it. The Tuesday and Friday classes will go on as usual. You are invited to join for soup supper downstairs after Arati, and then meditation back here at 7 p.m. So with that, we will do Arati. Yes. Geez, all right, the closing prayer, yes. Words up. Okay. May the divine, who is Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Great Spirit of the Native Americans, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the all-loving being manifest unto us and grant us abiding understanding and all-consuming divine love. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.